This past week, I was asked by somebody, what would it take for you to give up your faith, to conclude that it is false? And I somewhat facetiously said, well, dying, and then after I die, I encounter Allah and he's really angry. Yeah, that would be sufficient for me to consider that I was incorrect in my faith. Now, as I said, that's somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek response. But what I want to talk about in this video is that kind of question. The question, well, what would it take for you to give up your Christian faith? And I want to first of all address what I think is right about the question, and then what I think is wrong about the question, and why it's actually a lot more complicated than the question would suggest. So first of all, what's right about the question? What's right about the question, first of all, is that it really does focus us on considering the possibility that we could be wrong about something, that nobody has a God's eye point of view, right? We all have a limited, fallible human perspective, and there are all sorts of ways in which we could be wrong about our beliefs. And it's always important to be open to that and critical to disconfirming evidence for our beliefs. Paul talks about that explicitly when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15:14. He says that if Christ has not been raised, we are to be pitied most of all people. So, for example, if evidence came around that Jesus was not raised, then that would be an excellent reason to reconsider your Christian faith. That kind of question was explicitly addressed by the ancient historian Paul Maier, who's also a novelist, and he wrote a novel back in 1994 called The Skeleton in God's Closet, where he explores the possibility of this ancient, I think it's an ancient historian, Jonathan Weber is his name, this protagonist in the novel, who comes upon evidence at an archaeological dig for the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus's bones are discovered within the tomb, and they're, related to Jesus. I don't recall, but maybe they're in a bone box, Jesus, son of Joseph, an ossuary. And he has to begin to think, what do I do with this evidence, right? Do I reconsider my faith? This is a real, live, possible historical question that you need to consider. And so, yes, I think it is true that if you encountered Allah in the afterlife and he's pretty angry that you are Christian, that would be a reason to reconsider your faith, but so would discovering the bones of Jesus, right? Which is technically possible, right? Maybe not likely, but it's possible. Or some sort of evidence establishing, let's say, the incoherence of theism or of the doctrine of the Trinity, or some other particular issue. That could be an issue that you have to reconsider. And so it is important to be open to those kinds of questions. And what I think often is the case is that Christians, particularly conservative and evangelical Christians, come from backgrounds in which it is somehow considered impious to raise those kinds of questions, to consider what if I'm wrong. And that is not a sign of piety. That is a sign of intellectual immaturity if you refuse to consider the possibility that you could be wrong. And so to that extent, I think these are good questions that we do have to think about and take seriously. Now let me talk about what's wrong with the question. What's wrong with the question is that, first of all, it equates intellectual integrity with simply stipulating some point at which you would give up your faith. And I think actually giving up your faith, which is really a matter of changing your entire worldview in some key fundamental respects, that's not easy to know when you would do that. Because often worldviews are complex interpretive frameworks, which are not simply supported by a few lines of evidence, but provide overall encompassing interpretive frameworks for all sorts of evidence. And rarely, if ever, is it a simple matter that one particular issue or another is going to be the one thing that is going to flip you now from one worldview to another. Even the bones of Jesus being discovered in a tomb. I talk about this in a chapter in one of my books, You're Not as Crazy as I Think, where I raise this question. It says, well, what if the bones of Jesus, it seems that the bones of Jesus were rediscovered in the tomb. Would I, in fact, give up Christianity in the way that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15? Maybe I would. But it's a little more complicated than that. Why is it more complicated than that? Well, because I'm not simply a Christian because I believe there is historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That is central, of course. But I've encountered God, I believe, in all sorts of ways. God provides an overall framework for understanding my life. I believe I've had answers to prayer. I believe I've seen other people have had answers to prayer as well. Christianity is the largest of the world's religions, certainly is a very credible place to start when you want to talk about a plausible, on the face of it, account of ultimate reality. And many people from, C.S. Lewis famously put it, he says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing now, but it's not simply that I see that Christianity is true, but I see all other things through Christianity. That's borrowed from his little essay on Meditations in a Woodshed, I think it's called. So this idea that it isn't simply that you have some data point for Christianity, but it provides this overall encompassing framework of interpretation. And so the fact is that there have been many professed Christians throughout history who have found themselves doubting the historical resurrection of Jesus. And often what they did at that point was not say, okay, it's a switch flipped, I'm now no longer Christian, but rather they reinterpreted their understanding of the concept of resurrection and Christian faith in light of this disconfirming data point as they believed it was. And so the person I talk about in that chapter in particular, a close friend with N.T. Wright, is Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg, N.T. Wright, of course, famous New Testament scholar, defends the resurrection. Marcus Borg, famous New Testament scholar, theologian, who came to doubt the historical resurrection of Jesus. I don't think he had good reasons to doubt it myself, but he doubted it. And what he did was he reinterpreted his Christianity in light of his doubt, because he was a Christian for many more reasons than simply that single reason. And this is the thing that we all have to appreciate, that if you're a Christian, or if you're a naturalist, or if you're a Muslim, or if you are a nihilist or something else, all sorts of different possible worldviews, you are probably what you are for more than one or two single points. And so disconfirming or appearing to disconfirm one or two single points does not automatically make you something else. It may be that you end up reinterpreting your belief system in light of this new disconfirming evidence, and you continue to be a Christian, or a confessed Christian, or a nihilist, or an atheist, or a Muslim, or something else, but you've done some significant tweaks to your system in light of that fact. And as a result, to simply say, well, you can know when you would stop being a Christian, or you would stop being an atheist, or something else, is maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's a lot more complicated than that. So I think that picture is while it's a good question to raise, the problem is it's very simplistic, oversimplified. Often we don't know when we would stop believing what we believe, because the reasons that we believe are much more complicated than we often recognize. Think about it like this. Let's say that you have a beloved child, and you had a great relationship with your child, and then your child is arrested for murder. And you go to the court, you're convinced that your child is not guilty. And then the evidence begins to come in. The defense is offering a defense, but the prosecution is offering a line of evidence to show allegedly that your child is actually a serial killer. At what point would you begin to believe that, in fact, indeed, your child is a serial killer? Do you know when that point would be? Do you know precisely what the evidence would take, and no more and no less, but that amount of evidence would take to convince you that your child is a serial killer? I don't think you know that. Wouldn't know that. I would have to be in the moment and be weighing the evidence and trying to keep an open mind, while also recognizing that I have a unique perspective on my child, having been my child, but also recognizing that my relationship to my child could, to some degree, of course, cloud my objectivity. So I have both advantages in assessing the evidence, but also disadvantages as a parent. And I'm trying to weigh all of that and look at the evidence that is presented, keep an open mind, and then figure out when would I actually begin to believe that the prosecution had indeed made their case. And I have to ask those questions, perhaps, but to say that I have to be able to say at the outset when I would start believing my child was a serial killer is an unreasonable expectation. And in the same way, to say you have to be able to say when you would stop being a Christian in light of apparent disconfirming evidence is just an unreasonable expectation. So I understand why people ask the question, and I think it is something that we shouldn't view as impious. We should view it as an honest engagement with evidence, counter evidence, and wrestling with the truth and pursuing the truth, even though we see darkly as through a glass, as Paul famously said. But at the same time, don't think that we can simply reduce a rational, open, critical mind to being a mind that can say definitively the point at which you would stop believing the things that you currently believe.